What's going on, everybody? Jesse here. Welcome back to another episode. In this episode, well, you're not going to really be able to easily tell what we're going to do in this one, even though you might think that, hey, he's got a cool new landscape in there. That's what we're going to do. No, as a matter of fact, I did that in a supporters only live stream, which is now available to the public. You can go check that out. It should be in somewhere, either in the cards, description, or just go check out my YouTube library, and it's going to be in there. But no, actually, what we're doing in this episode is we're setting up our enhanced player inputs where we can move around the world using the new system. If you don't switch by the end of by the time 5.2 comes around, then you're going to be out of date. If you move into those systems, you've got to use the input action and the context mappings as they set it up. So yeah, we get that set up. We got everything working here. So like I said, you're not gonna be able to tell much difference in this intro like you normally would, because it's just stuff that we've been able to do before. It's just a new way of doing it, and I'm just demonstrating the fact that it's all set up now. So yeah, sit back, relax, and let's get this thing started. Today's episode and others just like it are brought to you by the patrons listed on the screen. If you'd like to support the channel and future development, then consider visiting my Patreon or Buy Me a Coffee page, where you can receive various benefits such as early access to my videos, project downloads, as well as personalized support. You may also want to consider joining the community by joining my Discord server, where you can receive help from me as well as the community. So come on over and be a part of the conversation. All right, so I'm going to open up my content browser here, and I'm going to come up here to the characters. I'm going to create a new folder inside of the characters folder, and I'm going to call this one input or inputs, because there's going to be more than one, so I plural it. And then inside inputs, I'm going to make one more folder, and I'm going to call this folder actions. And inside the folder actions is where we will have all of our movement actions. So I'm going to jump into here really quick, and I'm going to create, 6 for now. I'm going to create 6 input actions, and I'll just show the first one here. Inputs, right click and go up to inputs, and then input action right here. Create the first one, and I'm going to call this one IA_player_interact. All right, now I'm going to go ahead and create 5 more of these really fast. All right, with those done, I've got all 6 of them here. First one I called IA player interact. You saw me make that one. And then I did IA player jump. IA stands for input action, if you can figure that one out. And then IA player look, IA player move, IA player open inventory, and then the last one I created, IA widget close inventory. We'll get into all those in just a little bit. We'll hook them all up in just a couple minutes. But now let's go ahead and open these up, and let me show you. I've already made the changes to them. It's pretty simple here. I'm just going to flip through it really quick. So if we go up to the first one, IA player interact, it's going to be a digital boolean, and I changed its trigger. I added in a trigger here by hitting this little plus button, drop down, and right here you can see it drops down, and then I selected pressed. So now I want to go ahead and delete that one. We only need one. So I created the input interact, or the player interact, as pressed. And what pressed is going to do, that means as soon as you hit the button, it's going to trigger with it. But pressed makes it to where the trigger only happens once. Without this, if you hold the button down, it's going to pulse. It's going to happen a whole bunch of times. So that's the same logic here. If we move over now to the IA player jump, same thing, pressed. We want to make sure that as soon as we hit the jump button, that it only jumps once and that the trigger is only called once. So again, jump is pressed. We're going to go over to the IA player look, and I changed this to an axis 2D, vector 2D, no trigger. Player move, same thing, axis 2D. And now the IA player open inventory. Now I changed this, and I'll explain this one as well as the closed as we get to it. But I made this one a released. Okay, so select the release right there, and close inventory. Again, those are digital booleans with a released. So make sure you go ahead and save all of these. All right, open up the content browser now, and I'm going to jump up one level here. I'm going to go into the inputs folder, and I'm going to right click, go to inputs, and now let's go ahead and add our input mapping context. And I'm going to name this one IM_player. And let's create another one, and I'm going to call this one IM_widget. Let's go ahead and open up your IM player, and it's first mapping here. Let's go up here where it says mapping and hit the plus button and hit the drop down arrow here. And this first one, let's go ahead and make this one IA player move. Select that. Now if we grab the keyboard, just click on there and hit the W key. W will be our first one. Let's just set up all the key functionality, and then we'll go ahead and set up all the modifiers and triggers for all those. So W, go ahead and hit a plus sign here, and we'll do an S, hit another plus, and let's set this one up as A. Do one more, and this one will be a D. And then I'm going to go ahead and set up one last one for my player controller here. So if I select this, I got my player controller selected, and because this is movement, I am going to, not select that as a mouse. I'm actually going to come up here to gamepad and set this up to be the left thumbstick 2D axis. All right, so now let's go ahead and drop all these down, open these all up here, and get these all set up. So for the W, what we need here, we need a modifier here. So this modifier, we're going to actually add a swizzle input axis values. As it says there, it's useful to map a 1D input onto the y-axis of a 2D action. So 2D, that's what we want, forward and backwards. So select that one, and when this opens up, we get an index in here, and the order in which we need this particular one, we just want this as the default Y, X, and Z. All right, come down here now to the S, and for the S, we're actually going to add another swizzle to this one. All right, come down here, select swizzle. But now what we want this one to do, we actually need to add a second one. So under index 1, now let's make this one negate this. And what we needed to negate, you can have it, you can leave this as default for all three, but seeing as we're moving along the y-axis, this is the one we want it to negate. We want it to go negative. So when we hold the S key, we want it to go backwards. So we want to give it a -1 value. All right, and then for the A, we need to negate this one because A is left, and when we check the inputs, we're checking the right vector. So right vector is positive, and left would be a negative vector. So we need to negate this one. So drop it down, negate it, and like what we did with the last one, open this up. And since this is on the X axis, go ahead and deselect the Y and Z. Make sure the X is selected. For the D, we don't need any modifiers for the D. And down here for the thumbstick, we actually need 2 modifiers. And so I'll just drop both of them in here. The first one is dead zone. This just has to do, you can read the description right there, but this is just for the controller. You can adjust these for people, you know, sensitivity I think is pretty much what it's for with your joysticks. So you can set these up. I think you can change these at runtime so the player can adjust for any particular dead zones they may have in their controller. And then index 1, we're going to change this actually to a scalar. Now you could really leave these at a 1. To be honest, I kind of got this idea from the default first person template. They have these set at 50. I did some testing on this, 50, 50, and 1. This is just, if you were to like drop this down below 1 and you try to move, it's going to make your character move slower. So this is pretty much the maximum amount of value you can have come across to your joystick. So you can boost your joystick if you want, but it can't exceed these values here. All right, so that's what that one does. So let's go ahead and minimize all that now, add another mapping. And with this mapping, let's go ahead and make this the player look. This one's going to be the mouse X and Y 2D axis. Select that, and then we're going to actually add another one because I am hooking up gamepad controllers. You don't have to do the gamepad controllers if you don't want to, but I am setting it up. So I'm going to drop this down, select keypad or gamepad rather, and go right thumbstick 2D axis. Let's open these up here, and we're going to need a modifier for the mouse. And for the mouse, we want to negate, but we only want to open up the index. We only want to negate the Y value. So come down here now to the player controller, and under the modifiers, again, we need to add dead zone. And then that's the only one we're going to add for this one. And if you open up the drop down for this, you can see you can add your thresholds here before. This is what dead zone does. You can adjust the thresholds of when it's recognized, and you can set its type from radial to axial. But the defaults for this dead zone is just fine, just like it was with the last one. All right, so that's it for the player look. Let's open up a new mapping. And for this mapping, we are going to select the IA player jump, and this one should be pretty simple. We're just going to select that, hit the spacebar button. At least that's what I'm setting mine up as. We don't need any modifiers for that. Hit another plus button for the jump because I'm doing the player controller, and since my controller's hooked up, I'm just going to select this and push the A key on my button. I've got an Xbox type controller, so the bottom key bottom face button key is the A on my controller. It would be an X on a PlayStation style controller. So there's that. We don't need any modifiers for any of these. Let's add another mapping, and this next mapping will be for the interact. So this is when we're picking up items or just interacting with items into the world. Select this, and for me, I have my interact key as the E key. We don't need any modifiers for that. And for the gamepad, I am adding another one here. And for the gamepad, I'm just doing the face button top, which on the Xbox controller is the Y button, and on a PlayStation, I believe that would be the triangle. I believe that's a triangle button. All right, so we don't need any modifiers on that either. Now let's add another mapping here, and this next one we will do the open inventory, and this should be the last one that we have for right now. Player inventory, and for this one we set this up to be the tab key. All right, we don't need any modifiers on that. And for me, I set up here for the game controller or gamepad, I did the back button on the Xbox controller, or the selected button I think it is on the PlayStation controller, or as it shows here, that would be the gamepad special left button. So that's just the face button, like I said, the select on a PlayStation or the back on a Xbox controller. So let's go ahead and open up our IM widget, add a new mapping for this one. And of course, this is the last one we have left is the IA close. And for this, I'm going to set this up the same way we just set up the open. I want it to be the tab. And again, one more, we'll set it up gamepad special left. No modifiers on these. And there we go. We have our inputs and our mappings all set up. So now let's go hook up our player controller. All right, so now we're inside the true first-person player controller, or wherever you have your input set up as, is where we want to go ahead and make the changes. So this is actually, most of this code is all actually pretty much going to go away. It's going to be a little bit cleaner with the new input axis mappings, or action mappings, I should say. So I'm just going to come in here and I'm going to start dumping these. So we got the forward and back right there, and the right and left right there. So let's drop in, right click, and go IA move. This is our movement component. So IA player move. I'm going to select the event, not the value. And we get this in here. Hopefully you guys are familiar with this. I'm not going to go over and I'm not going to explain all these. I guess maybe I can, just in case you're not familiar with it and you're seeing this for the first time. Triggered means this is going to run the entire time the button is held down for this. So it's just a continuous stream of the button, unless you set it up like we talked about just a minute ago with like jump in and interact, where it is just the pressed. It's only going to trigger once. Start, if you have it set up to be like this is going to recognize as soon as you push the button down, and completed is when you release the button up. If you have something like where it's pressed, as soon as you hit this once, start and then completed are called instantaneously. First start, then completed right away, as well as triggered. All three of them are called at the same time. I think it's actually start, triggered, and then completed, or it could be triggered, start, completed. Either way, ongoing. If you have it to where like we have with our opening inventories, where we have it set on release, if we're holding the button down before we release it, that's going to be ongoing. So this is going to run and take a whole bunch of times until we actually complete the trigger, which would be releasing the tab button, at which point this will get called. And then canceled, I haven't found any use case of that, but if the action gets canceled before it's ever triggered, this is called. All right, so right here you'll get, I'll show you this in just a couple minutes. You can drop down and we got other information here. This will be useful for like setting up, holding a button down for a certain amount of time. You can get that information right in here, or triggered seconds, how long the trigger's been called for, etc. We're going to open up action mappings here. So let's right click on this and split the struct, because this is a 2-axis value that we set up in the action input. We've got these right here. So now what we need to do, let's go ahead and start with the, let's start with the right vector. I'm gonna move this up right here, and I'm just gonna kind of organize this a little bit so we can get this all hooked up here. I didn't really change anything. I just moved the right vector up front because it's just going to make my hookups better, because X would be the right vector, left and right. So I'm going to hook that up to the scalar value here of the first movement input, and then the Y to the second scale value of the other move input. And then I'm just going to move this down. I'm going to hook the trigger up to the movement input and this movement input into this one. And let's go ahead and just clean this up a little bit. And there we go. That's pretty simple. Got that all hooked up now. So, and that should work. We'll test these all out in just a couple minutes. You can test it out now. This should work just fine. But I know this works, so I'm not going to waste your guys' time by showing you. We'll do one test run at the end. So there, our movement settings are all set up for that. Take a look. All right, so let's move down to the jump next. Again, this is going to be fairly simple. Right click and let's go IA jump. And then this one is going to be as well hooked up to the triggered will be set to jump. And then I'm going to go ahead and delete that one. And then the stop jump, because this is set up as a press, it will only be called once. Okay, so we set this on completed. So when it's done and we release, we're going to stop jumping, or actually press. No, it's going to hit jump and then it's going to stop jump. Okay, so it's just going to be called simultaneously, or instantaneously, I should say, not simultaneously. The triggered will be first and stop jump will be called second. So that's it for the jump. Come over here now. Let's go ahead and do the pitch look. Now this was set up as a gamepad pitch and yaw, and we had the mouse pitch and yaw in the old settings. We don't need that anymore. I'm just going to delete all this gamepad because we're not even going to need these modifiers here, the turn rate of the gamepad. I'm going to delete that, and I actually can come over here, the turn rate gamepad variable, delete that. I'm going to compile it just because. Now let's go ahead and IA look. We got this all set up now, and all we have to do with this, I'm just going to grab the, because we're in the player controller, all we have to do is get the add yaw and add pitch inputs. If you're inside the player character, you should already have this, but you'll need to get the player controller, and then from your player controller reference, you'll have to get the add input yaw and add input pitch. And I'm just going to duplicate these just so I don't have to disconnect the cables. And the first one, let's hook up the yaw first and then the pitch, just like what we did with the movement. Just hook them in here straight to the triggered, and this is going to pulse. We didn't set this as pressed or anything, so this is just going to pulse and continually hit this just like it would in the past. All right, so right click on the action value and split this pin. The X will go into the yaw and the Y will go into the pitch, and that's it. That's all we have to do for our looking function. That will work now both with the mouse as well as with the gamepad controller. All right, so that's with that all settled. The last thing we need to do here in our player controller, or again, if you're doing it on your player character, however you want to do it, this function is actually on the player controller. So if you're doing this on the player character, you will have to get a reference to your actual, you'll have to cast to, and we'll do it in a little bit when we go over to our widget, but you have to actually cast to your actual player controller that you're using and get that and grab the enhanced input subsystem, get enhanced input local player. That's a pretty convoluted name, enhanced input local player subsystem. If you just type the word subsystem when you have a reference to your player controller, I guess input subsystem will work. There we go. We select this, and from here, let's make sure that this is valid. I'm going to grab the macro just because it's already got the execution pins. And from here, if it is valid, then what we need to do is drag off of the subsystem, and let's go add mapping context and hook this up to the is valid. And the mapping context that we want will be the player mapping context. Now we're going to set the priority on here. I'm going to set this priority to 1. Generally, we're used to like a zero-based system where 0 comes first when we're programming, but for this particular use case, I found that that's actually not the case with the priority on this. The higher number on here will take priority over the lower ones. Now we don't have that issue right now when we go to use our other input or our other mapping context. But I'm setting this as a 1 because in the future there could be a conflict. Really, if you want to make sure that this one takes priority over all other calls, then you might want to set this to 10, or depending on how many you have, whichever one you want to be the most important, you set that number higher. So this is all we need. Make sure you compile it and save it. Now let's jump over to our player widget, our primary HUD. All right, I lied. We're going to start over here in the player character. We got a few things to do over here. It'll be a little bit better if we start over here. I'm going to come up here to the begin play. I'm going to disconnect this just for a second. We need to get a reference to the player controller. So I'm just going to hold S and I'm going to drop into sequence. And I'm going to hook all the original stuff back up into the then 1. And right off the bat, I'm just going to go get player controller. And we need to cast this in order to get access to the enhanced player input subsystem. We got to have the actual player controller. Let's go cast to true first person PC. That's the name of mine. And hook that up. And I'm just going to right click off of this and promote it to variable. Call it player controller. And there we go. We got that all set up. So now with our player controller, I'm going to come down here where I have it hook it up to opening up the inventory, and on the sequence between these two where we set the game mode to UI only, I'm actually going to go ahead and delete the game mode, and I'm going to pull off the player controller here and go set input mode to game and UI. We want the game here. Now, before we didn't want this one because you can still control the player when you're in this mode and we have the mouse cursor visible, and that's not something we wanted to happen. But now with this new system, we can choose the different input mappings that we're using, and generally speaking, you can have a lot of the input mapping context. You can have multiple of them in a row and working together. But when you're sharing the same buttons as we are with the opening and closing of the inventory, you need to, or when you're using the same, I should say, when you're using the same input action, then not necessarily the same button, but the same action, input action, when you're using the same one, you need to use different, you need to disable one of the context in order to do that. So if we created here a separate, well, we did create a separate one. If we used the same open, let's just drop that in here, IA open inventory. If we use this, if we just call this like IA open close inventory, and we use this one for both the widget and the player, even if it's in a different context, if you're using the same action, it's going to call all the actions that are implemented everywhere. So it's going to open and close the inventory at the same time. So you're never going to be able to actually toggle between the two. And you probably could figure it out with, you could do like flip flops and other ways like that. But I'm just going to see there's going to be other options down the road where we're using different actions for our widgets. So that's why I created a separate one. Plus it's a good learning experience. All right, so since this is a interface call, this stays the same. This is our actual input action. So I'm going to delete that. And from here, I'm just going to go straight to my trigger and plug that in there into that one. And from here, I'm going to get our player controller, and I'm going to get the input subsystem. All right, and drag off of here. Now, the first thing we need to do, we need to go remove mapping context. And again, we don't probably need to really do this, but because we are using the tab key to open and close it, even though we're using different input actions, the tab key will still activate both of them. So we run into the same problem that I just described. It's one hand or the other, whatever you want to do, however you want to handle it is up to you. But I'm just going to go ahead and disable the player context. Right, and then I'm going to drag off of here again, and I'm going to go ahead and add mapping context, plug her in, and the one I'm going to add is our widget context. All right, so that's all we have here, and I'm just going to leave this as a priority of 0, because if for some reason these are hooked up at the same time, I want this one to have a lower priority than the player controller. But now by removing this player context, we won't be able to move the player around. All the movement inputs that we just set up in the last section will not be active. So one other thing we need to do while we're in here, we need to set up the interact button. So if we come down here, we've got our interact right there. Let's go IA interact right there and delete this. And now all we need to do is just hooked up the trigger to the is valid right there. That should be good enough for our interactions. And now we can go ahead and head on over to our primary HUD widget. All right, so there's only a couple things that we got to do in here, so it should be fairly simple and straightforward. Off the event construct, we're going to do like we just did in the begin play of our player character, is let's go get player controller, and we're going to have to cast to your custom player controller. So cast to PC true first person for me, and hook that up to the construct, and go ahead and save this to a variable. I'm just going to call it player controller. All right, now that we have that set up, we need to come down here now, doing a bunch of testing. I don't want this. This was posing to be a little bit more problem. We weren't able to get quite the functionality that we need. Now, it's not easy to use player inputs in widgets. It's not still really designed for that. I did a lot of testing to get this to work, and it works well. There's still going to be a lot of things that we have to do, and I'll explain in a minute, that we still end up having to do in on key down and on key up. But for now, some basic functionality, the keyboard presses and things like that, we can use these context mappings to do those things in our widget blueprints. But it's still not technically really designed for that. They haven't made that completely easily accessible. I don't know. I hope you understand what I'm talking about, but let's go ahead and delete the on focus. We don't need that one. What we do need to do though is we need to get the event tick, and in our event tick, what we need to do is you can grab your variable if you want, but I'm just going to get player controller, and from here I'm going to select has user focus. All right, so user focus, does this player controller have this the widget, which is the self, are a primary HUD? If it doesn't have focus, and if it does, we don't really want it to. That's why we got rid of that last one. We don't want it to have the direct focus on it. What we need to do is just drag off the true and go set focus to viewport right here. Set focus to game viewport, and that's what we want to happen now. If this widget has focus on it, we want to shift it over to the game viewport. Like I said, I did a lot of testing on this, and I just happened to stumble upon this focused game viewport, and that was really the savior for enabling functionality in here. So make sure you have that. All right, and we're going to end up having to set that, I think, in our player slot. But if we do, we'll worry about that another day. So for right now, the event tick, got that set up. So now all we need to do is go IA widget close inventory is the one we want. Select that. So now in order to close the inventory, pull off of the triggered, and let's go close menu, call our custom function close menu, and then grab our player controller. And we're just going to reverse what we did on the player character when we open this. Grab our input subsystem, and from this, let's go remove mapping context. And now the one we want to remove is the IM widget, and drag off of here. Let's go add mapping context, and you've probably guessed it, the IM player is the one we want to add. So now we have that set up. So now where we originally had this set up was in the on key down. So let's open this up, and here we had it. We had the tab and escape key. Now if you remember, I didn't use the escape key in our input action. You can if you want to, but unless you're doing this in here, pushing the escape key while the game is running in the editor, it's just going to close the editor. So you can have the escape key, but you're not going to be able to exit out of the inventory widget while playing in editor. It's just going to close the game out. So not a big deal. Whatever you want to do. I'm just going to go ahead and really disconnect this. You can delete pretty much everything in here now. So I'm just going to delete these. I'm going to leave this for me for now because like I put in here in the comment, you can come back here and use the same logic to do other things in the widget. But I'm going to leave this disconnected. On key down is essentially not done. So now everything should be hooked up. Let's go ahead and test this all out. Well, you probably recognize that the map setting has changed a little bit here. Got a little bit going on. That wasn't in the last episode. If you haven't seen the live stream where we talk about bringing in real world landscapes and terrains and things like that, then go check out the live stream. There will be a link somewhere, or you can just jump into the channel and go check it out. It's a little bit long, but I do go over quite a bit here about making custom open world landscapes, large scale landscapes, as well as using real world data. So go check out that live stream. I may do a shorter video on that in the future, but for now, if you want that information, it's in my live stream. So now that we're here, if we activate the panel, move the mouse, and everything seems to be working properly. There we go. We can look up, look down, jump, use the keyboard to move left and right, forward, backwards. So that all seems to be working. Come up here and press E. We're able to interact with that. Open up our inventory, hit tab, and there we go. We hit tab again and it closes down, and we can still drag and move our stuff around, eat it. Open up the inventory, we can still drag in between there. So everything was set up properly. So yeah, that's where we're at with this one. I hope you guys enjoyed this episode. In the next one, I think what we're going to do is we're going to start setting it up to where when we have items in our inventory, that we are going to be able to split the stack and move different stack sizes around. We're only going to have a couple options initially with that, but we'll set up the functionality for that. We got to do a total rewrite of one of our core functions for moving items around, but that's not too big of a deal. Shouldn't be too much of a hassle. Yeah, so I hope you guys enjoyed this episode. If you did, please do me a favor, go down, hit that like button, leave me a comment, show some interaction on the channel. Let me know if you liked it, or if you have any questions, anything like that. And let's see YouTube, as you've heard before, let's the YouTube algorithms know that people are interested in this video, so it just kind of gets a little bit more exposure. If you want to join the conversation, come on over to the Discord and join me over there. Until the next episode, peace.